Hello everyone, welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. That's right, it is your online adult adolescence psychology course, and I'm here to walk you through the hottest topics in identity. With that said, let's jump right into it. The way people feel and view themselves changes over time. Adolescence marks the first substantial reorganization of people's sense of self at a time when they can appreciate the significance of these changes. So it's not that there's no changes prior to this developmental period, but rather kind of with increases in cognitive change, puberty, and depending on kind of your school of thought, maybe increased socialization, accumulation of knowledge from the group from a Vygotsky perspective. Some combination of those things contributing to an adolescent being able to kind of appreciate who they are or who they think they are at this period, more so than what they did, at 5, 6 years old, and also think about the future as well. As stated, these developmental shifts in identity are predicted by puberty and identity development, such as fundamental biological, cognitive, and social changes to people during this developmental period. Cognitive change and identity development. They can imagine possible selves. That is, various identities adolescents might imagine for themselves. It can contribute to increase in self-consciousness and experimentation. Future orientation, extent to which an individual is able and inclined to think about the potential consequences of decisions and choices. Questions emerge, such as, who will I become? Who am I really? This is associated with less risky and impulsive behaviors. So during adolescence, emerging adulthood, you're able to imagine yourselves in different ways. You can ask yourself, who am I now? And kind of evaluate if that's who you want to be. And thus, if you feel good about it, feel bad about it, you can experiment regardless, though. You can either dive deeper into that quote-unquote identity or, try and take on a new identity during adolescence. Thus, this combination of experimentation and at the same time self-consciousness, because constantly you're thinking about yourself, self-reflection, which can be, positive and negative. For a whole host of reasons, one of which adolescents aren't really great at kind of understanding what other peers are thinking about them. They're kind of just projecting outward. Then this idea of future orientation. Now adolescents are at an age, a developmental period, wherein they're thinking about the future. So will I have children? Will I become married? Will I live in this state forever? Who am I? Who do I want to be? What career do I want to be? And obviously those things aren't locked in stone, at 13, 14, 15 years, or whatever, 16 years old, but you still start to think about it and come up with scenarios in your head, even if they're not fully accurate in the future. And one reason why this future orientation may be associated with decreased impulsive behaviors and less risky, just impulsive behavior, negative risky behaviors. This future orientation kind of is associated with a decline in those kind of behaviors. Maybe because you're literally thinking about the future. You have a long-term goal and you're trying to work towards it. And it's always kind of in the back of your mind, if I do this thing, if I take this action, is it consistent with achieving my future long-term outlooks? Again, even if they're accurate or not in the future. Social roles. In modern industrialized societies, adolescence/emerging adulthood is associated with important school, work, and relationship decisions. This structure makes it necessary to ask identity-related questions. What kind of person do I want to be? Should be understood not as a single developmental process, but interrelated developmental processes which influence each other. So we've talked about, as you reach 18, 19, 17 years old, you have to, your decisions start to become more impactful. You're no longer in kindergarten, you're like, oh, what color should I draw with today? Now it's like, oh, what college degree should I take? Where should I go to college? Should I try hard in this class? Should I get a job? Should I marry this person? All these kind of questions have more or less, higher levels of long-term consequences than, a kindergartner, for example. So this kind of structure, these kind of the way that we've structured society presents adolescents, emerging adults, with these questions that they kind of have to answer. And even if they don't answer, they're going to drift along and kind of just answer. They're going to answer kind of through their actions, just kind of like staying in their hometown and working whatever job. So part of that though is not just those specific kind of career and relationship questions, but also like, who do I want to be? What are my morals? What are my values? And thus, like, what kind of careers, or what do I value more? Those kind of things. And at the same time, as stated, this is not just a single process, but rather interrelated developmental processes. So you have social development going on, cognitive development going on, you're coming into a more clear understanding. Again, these things shift with time, obviously, but like your ideological perspective on the world, your religious beliefs, your political beliefs, all these kind of things happening at the same time, and also all those important decisions. So all these kind of developmental processes working separately on one hand, but also really they're kind of all interconnected, because you can imagine your values translating towards like your school, what major you want, what work you want, what kind of job you would like, and whatever your relationships, priorities. Self-conceptions. Collections of traits and attributes that individuals use to describe or characterize themselves. More consistency between how people describe themselves and how they behave as they move through adolescence. So kind of the idea here is that, 5, 6 years old, 4 years old, whatever, you can ask a young child, or a middle child in middle childhood, describe yourself. Tell me a little about yourself. And there is some consistency, but also there's a lot more fluctuations in how, a 5-year-old will describe themselves day by day. Than like a 16-year-old or, an 18-year-old. Obviously, there's still going to be change throughout those lives, but kind of like they have more of a consistent idea of identity by that point. I should say, however, that's the idea of identity in the self varies pretty significantly across culture. So I'm really kind of focused on kind of like Western Europe and kind of like U.S. Identity development. Researchers ask questions such as, tell me about yourself. Adolescents are more likely to describe what they are like in different situations than overall generalizations. So for example, I'm a nice person versus I'm chill with people I know. There's a realization of personality is expressed in different ways in different situations. Better understanding they are perceived differently by different people. My parents think I'm a loser, for example, but I'm a party animal. A tip to reconcile contradictory behaviors into a coherent self. So, kind of as stated, researchers can just ask the question, tell me about yourself. And then you can ask like 6-year-olds and you can ask 16-year-olds, and then kind of compare not just the specific responses, but kind of like the underlying ways that they respond. So for example, some very broad statements such as like, I'm nice, I'm bad, I'm great, whatever, versus, and that's in like 5, 6-year-olds. So again, kind of very broad generalization. So something, I'm nice, thus I'm nice everywhere, theoretically. Versus a 16-year-old is like, I'm nice with my friends, with this one group of people, I don't really like them, so I'm not super nice. My parents, we're kind of like hit or miss. So kind of like a much more, they describe their selves based much more, they consider their environment more when describing themselves. And come to realize that their personality, which again, depending on your school of thought about personality, is kind of like your consistent quote-unquote self. A lot of caveats here, but whatever. Good, what we got to work with. So that kind of like consistent personality, even though you can say, oh, I am whatever, a nice person, but being a nice person for my parents means doing the chores. Being a nice person with my friend means giving them advice. Being a nice person to a random stranger means whatever, nodding your head at them and smiling or something. So kind of your idea here is that you have that same overall niceness, but expressed differently in different environments, and people exist outside of you. So even though you conceive yourself, for example, as nice, other people may consider you differently. So kind of that increased understanding of the role of the environment and the perspective of people increases, other people increases with age. And some cultural differences that I'll allude to are really one here. There are many others. U.S. adolescents tend to focus on their feelings/social life when establishing an identity, while more collectivist cultures like China tend to focus on responsibilities and accomplishments. So you can see kind of more of a collective, like, oh, a sense of duty to the group, and kind of like, how am I contributing to it? That's kind of like accomplishments. Again, those are very, very, very broad statements, and those even play out. There's not just one, the collective, and obviously in all cultures constantly shifting, and thus there'll be kind of differences. And there's interesting literature about that of how adolescent or Chinese adolescents differ from like Chinese 40, 50-year-olds, for example, which just represents that culture changes due to a whole host of macro structures that are going on in the world around them. They, in fact, also have cohort effects, as does every country. Self-esteem, degree to which individuals feel positively or negatively about themselves. No to very little generational differences in self-esteem in the U.S. Traditionally thought to be linked to school success, but this is not consistently found. Many studies have found high self-esteem associated with lower academic outcomes. Academic success predicts self-esteem, not the opposite direction. Low self-esteem is associated with increased risk of depression, likely due to low self-esteem students being less likely to seek social support. Behavioral problems are even more contradictory. Low self-esteem adolescents who engage in antisocial behavior as a group is associated with higher self-esteem. They earn approval from peers. It is also associated with experimentation with alcohol, possibly because they're more popular and at more parties where alcohol is present. So self-esteem is one of the most poorly understood and kind of pop psyche constructs in psychology. Very much hype. It's a little less so, but like 10 years ago or so, it was very, very hype as like kind of almost a panacea. Like it's just very much obsession with kind of self-esteem and its kind of predictors. And you also still see this a ton with kind of like self-help books, very, very committed to like self-esteem. But kind of just walking through some of these findings. For example, academic success. So kind of what research shows at this moment is that achievement and something like academic success is predictive of self-esteem, not the other way around. So it's not that you have high self-esteem and therefore you're going to do well on a test, but rather you do well on the test and then you increase your self-esteem in this study. However, low self-esteem, however, is associated with a risk of depression in some samples. It's possibly due to maybe kind of a negative overall evaluation of yourself, and thus you're like, I don't want to deal with, I don't want to bother anybody, I don't want to burden anybody, I'm kind of alone, and therefore, again, you're kind of losing your social support, you're isolated, and thus kind of your increased risk of depression. But there are also many interesting correlations that find that high self-esteem is also associated with kind of negative developmental outcomes. So, for example, increased experimentation with alcohol. So it's like, oh, I have high self-esteem. I'm probably going to be a little more popular in high school. Therefore, I'm going to be around, maybe be able to attend more parties where the high school students are not monitored, less supervision, unstructured time, and thus may be exposed to more drug abuse or higher likelihood of drug abuse. But interestingly, you also have this effect wherein kind of low self-esteem adolescents kind of group together, which we've already talked about. So kind of, what can happen is those low self-esteem adolescents coming together and engaging in antisocial behavior and doing it well, like, woo, I vandalized something, you're in a group, you're like, woo, we did it, and you're like celebrating, and then, that makes you feel good. You now feel good about yourself. You've been praised by the group, so now you have a very, very, very high self-esteem, but also at the same time, you're more likely to commit antisocial behaviors, and probably, if you're in that group, probably perform worse at school, have worse social relationships with your family, non-antisocial peers, sense of belonging in school, all those kind of things. So you can see that's just one example, but there are many examples wherein just having too positive a view of yourself, almost like it can be unrealistic, a positive view of yourself, or deriving self-esteem from negative sources is associated with kind of these antisocial outcomes. There are also racial differences in self-esteem. U.S. white female adolescents are more likely to report lower or fluctuating self-esteem through adolescence than U.S. black female adolescents. Black teenagers are protected by support and positive feedback of adults in the black community. Latino teenagers are higher risk of maladjustment when lower number of Latino families in the neighborhood. There are country differences. The gap between teenaged male and female self-esteem is lower in underdeveloped countries. May place less emphasis on physical appearance could be related to different concepts of the self. Sense of identity, extent to which individuals feel secure about who they are and who they are becoming. So we have racial differences in the US and the kind of overall level of self-esteem and the fluctuation in self-esteem. And then interestingly, we have other predictors of self-esteem by races. So we're in kind of protection or buffering effect. We're in kind of support from for U.S. black adults and kind of just community in general, positive kind of community experiences, kind of increasing kind of self-esteem or just kind of overall well-being in black adults or black adolescents, I should say, and kind of the same kind of idea with Latino adolescents. We're in kind of having a neighborhood wherein other Latino families live. So theoretically, some kind of cultural similarity, maybe kind of this allows for a maintained sense of cultural identity, maybe kind of a neighborhood kind of monitoring wherein parents are kind of working with each other, again, kind of like the tribe, raising the tribe kind of thing, decreasing the likelihood of maladjustment, I should say, in Latino teenagers. We also see kind of differences in countries, and there's many differences, but this one right here, kind of the gap between male and female self-esteem is larger in kind of industrialized countries. And some reasons of that can include kind of like a greater emphasis on physical appearance, which can, because of traditional kind of gender expectations and roles, put women at a higher risk of negative developmental outcomes. So maybe in places that are poor, maybe you have like less money or something along those lines to just have kind of makeup or be kind of obsessed with like a dress or be less exposed to kind of like fashion magazines or kind of, and then just not that, but kind of like an overall culture less emphasized on kind of physical appearance through kind of the absence of that like then body type ideal, but also there's some research that says that some kind of political values or in cultural values removed from those kind of thin body ideals also impact the likelihood of low self-esteem. This also can be related to different definitions of the self. I'm not going to go super into that in this class. I teach another class, but there are literally different ways that we define themselves. In the West, we really think of this self as like a stable unit, unaffected by others. That is not like the same. People have different, more accepted, and are more accepting of like fluctuations of the self across cultures. Other findings of self-esteem. Critics question the study of self-esteem in the general sense because an individual may have varied self-esteem levels in different areas. So kind of the idea here is that, oh, I have a lot of self-esteem in math, or I have a lot of self-esteem in talking to random people, but I don't have a lot of self-esteem with talking to my closest friends, or I don't have a lot of self-esteem in music. So there's not just like the self-esteem. Even within broad category or domains of self-esteem, adolescents often have differentiated views of themselves. Some aspects of self-esteem contribute more to overall self-image than others. Adolescents are often unaware what contributes most to their self-esteem. Self-esteem derived from peers rather than teachers or parents is greater risk of more behavioral problems and poor school outcomes, or achievement, I should say. So kind of breaking just down a couple of these things is that although we can have, as stated before, different levels of self-esteem in different areas, so whatever, self-esteem in music, self-esteem in math, self-esteem in reading, depending on a person or a group, different domains or different areas may impact their overall self-image more than others. So let's just say I don't care about music, so I'm like, okay, my self-esteem in music is very, very low, but I also don't value music at all, so who cares? It doesn't affect me. Versus maybe I super value reading, and I'm like, my self-esteem is like moderate or something in reading, and that bothers me more because it's like, oh, I really value reading. So kind of our evaluations and the importance we place on these different areas can also influence how much your self-esteem in a particular area matters. Not only that, so as I stated, how we evaluate the importance of particular areas influences the degree to which the self-esteem in that area impacts our overall development. Often teens and adolescents are not even aware of which areas they are that contributes most, that they value the most. So it could be something like, again, so I have very low music self-esteem, or very low self-esteem in art, very low self-esteem in math. Well, let's just say I don't know which of those three domains I like more. I don't know which one is more important to me. I'm still like going through some identity development situation, so I can't even determine which of the areas of low self-esteem are impacting me the most. And then finally, kind of going back to that antisocial peer group kind of finding that I stated before, where you derive your sense of self-esteem matters. So it's different. So deriving self-esteem from positive parents, teachers, respected members of the community are associated with more positive outcomes than deriving your self-esteem from your peers, and especially kind of like antisocial peers. Thus, the findings and the research of self-esteem is far more complicated than kind of like a general, like, oh, self-esteem is good. And then, in fact, many cultures really don't value self-esteem that much at all. Let's talk about dimensions in personality in adolescence. The most common one is the Big Five model. This theory argues that there are 5 basic dimensions to personality: extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, and openness to experience. An easy way to remember this is ocean. There are both genetic and environmental influences on personality, although the environment becomes somewhat more important as people age. Personality becomes increasingly stable as we grow older, can still be influenced by macro level kind of environmental factors. Despite popular stereotypes, research does not show that adolescence is a time of tumultuous upheaval in personality. So we get the Big Five that you may be familiar with. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on how this Big Five is derived. I do so in other courses, so if you're interested, then feel free to contact me. But basically, we have 5 kind of dimensions of personality that theoretically all people have. So, for example, extroversion is like the easy one. Again, a little pop psyche, but whatever. So you can imagine each one of these 5 dimensions you can score 0 to 100 on. So an extroversion, say 0 is introversion and 100 is extroversion, and you fall at 55. So something along those lines. And you get a number for each one of those 5 domains, which then theoretically tell you about your personality. And it's thought that as you age, your personality becomes a little more stable. Granted, new research, like literally pretty new, suggests that your personality can change more than what's been traditionally expected. So, for example, study on COVID found that huge personality, or not huge, but kind of like personality shifts that are thought to take 10 years or more happened in like 1 year. So it just demonstrates that kind of big macro events impact literally, again, who you are as a quote unquote individual person. Those kind of big events kind of structure how we all are. But interestingly, the Big Five has, but then the question basically I should say is, does the Big Five, and that Big Five is really applied to kind of US adults traditionally, like Western Europe, doesn't apply to the whole world? Like, is that all the same personality components? Because theoretically, it's supposed to be like, oh, that's human personality, and every single culture, every single person is made up of those specific 5 domains, ocean. So, is that true? Well, no. Research has not found that to always be true. So, for example, in China, they found 4 kind of domains of personality. They consist of dependability, which is described as responsibility, optimism, trustworthiness. It's kind of like neuroticism, so you can see that kind of correlation there. Social potency, leadership, adventurous, kind of like extroversion, so kind of correlated there. Individualism, so self-orientation, defensiveness, a little bit like agreeableness, but then interpersonal relatedness, harmony, relational orientation, and tradition. This is really not correlated with anything in the Big Five. And not only that, but openness to experience was not among the personality dimensions, the traits identified in this study. So again, this tells us that, oh, culture matters. And it can impact on, how you describe yourself and kind of the things that make up your personality. In adolescent development, that matters because, or I should say, to even measure kind of like adolescent adulthood in kind of this hypothetical Chinese sample, you would have to use these 4 kind of traits versus like the Big Five of the U.S. Kind of using that same Big Five wouldn't really be culturally accurate. Wouldn't give you really accurate data because it's kind of a cultural bias within that framework. If it's not just in China, there is a problem and a difficulty in kind of trying to generalize personality findings and kind of what even makes up personality across the world, and specifically non-weird populations, which is defined as white, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic, as I've talked about in this class before. And even within the kind of framework, weird is a useful framework, but even you can look at kind of the potential bias even within kind of that abbreviation, wherein like education is going to be defined as like, oh, college degrees from like the US, or like democratic, aka how we specifically define democracy, which even varies in like Western Europe, like parliamentary systems, let alone in other parts of the world. But looking at a specific other group, the Sine-Main, which is who are a Bolivian indigenous group, they do not have the same personality structure in the vocabulary, and they seem to only have 2 personality factors, neither of which maps into any of the 5 factors. So in this group, this Bolivian indigenous group, rather than have a Big Five, they only have 2 personality factors, and neither one of those factors are correlated with the US Big Five. So again, kind of the importance of taking culture into consideration when considering personality, and kind of the developmental milestones that adolescents are trying to achieve throughout the world and during a specific kind of historical period. The social context. The course of identity development varies by culture and historical era. Rates of identity confusion have increased in Japan as collectivism has declined. These collectivist rates are in return influenced by other structures such as the economy, politics, and history. Adolescence identity is influenced by recognition on the part of society. Thus, society will influence which sorts of identities are possible. Society shapes which identities are genuine options. Society also influences which identities are desirable/undesirable. We are all shaped by these structural constraints. Because of the rapid change of because of the rapid rate of social change, the likelihood of experiencing a prolonged and difficult identity crisis is greater today than in previous historical eras. Even in underdeveloped countries, as they become more, quote, modern, those types of, quote, individual decisions are more likely to emerge. So again, as stated, identity development depends on your culture and your historical era. And as I stated before, culture changes. Things interact with culture, and then this really gets to the point of like, what is your theory on how culture is created? What other things interact to create culture? And one interesting thing is looking at Japan, and I've already mentioned China, but kind of the idea here is that Japan traditionally thought as, again, a kind of a quote-unquote collectivist culture, but at the same time now, as they've become industrialized, as capitalism has been introduced, as more individualistic values have emerged, this is kind of contradictory and clashing in some ways with the previous cultural identity. So thus you kind of get generational effects, and not just that, but then it's like, okay, how do I reconcile these kind of 2 competing belief systems, and what do we do about it? Does this lead to like more distress? Is there more negative developmental consequences? Is there more positive? Whatever. You also see this in kind of like Native American tribes, wherein kind of they, in that context, kind of losing their traditional culture, while at the same time being kind of like integrated / kind of not really, but having to at least interact with these larger, historically non-traditional economic and political and social systems, which is associated with kind of increase of like drug abuse and suicide and depression in Native American tribes. So as like countries become and people become quote unquote more modern, aka just more like the being introduced to industrialization and like our current form of like capitalism and all that kind of thing, you now have to your kind of old cultural practices are kind of less valued, and cultural practices that reflect like having to make those choices. Again, adolescence, now you have to make career choices, family choices, education choices, and all kind of new careers and things that like did not exist like 30 years ago. So thus it's kind of hard for your parents kind of to help out sometimes. So as that kind of quote unquote modernization process is undergoing, and more and more people have to kind of deal with that. And those types of quote unquote individual decisions that are kind of reflected in kind of the US, theoretically expected to kind of like rise elsewhere. So you have kind of like developmental trajectories moving depending on these larger structural events going on across the world. But not only that, as we've already talked about, society recognizes and has kind of like rites of passage for adolescence. Not so much in the US, like universal ones, but still, even in the US, society influences and tells you which kind of identities are possible, because some identities, for example, are looked down upon by society, and this is going to change by historical, period. But some are like, oh, these are desirable identities to achieve or chase for towards or develop towards as an adolescent, emerging adult, and these are identities which are frowned by society. So you kind of have kind of social pressure, while at the same time, there's really not even genuine options. So for example, it's very difficult to just be like an artist, like, the kind of classic, like struggling artist kind of thing. Those are kind of like constraints by society that you have to kind of recognize and navigate through. It doesn't mean it's correct, not correct, but the fact of the matter means is like those constraints, those structural constraints exist, and you have to deal with them. They can change through time, like culture does, for example, but still, in a given moment of time, you have to kind of adapt and deal with them. So like one obvious example could be something like, oh, tell your parent at like 17, like, oh, I'm not gonna go to college. I'm gonna just stay home and be a famous Twitch streamer and then make millions of dollars. And then your parents are like, don't do that. That is not desirable. You're going to be at home and be like a loser online person who has no friends. So kind of like that social pressure, not really a desirable career kind of thing. Now, a little less so now, again, kind of historical era matters, technology matters, but still kind of if you told your parents that, yeah, that's my career goal at like 17, they would be like, hey, also maybe get a degree at the same time. So again, kind of society shapes how we view certain careers, and we can agree with those, disagree with them, and there are also kind of subdivisions. This also varies by like racial group, disability status, all these other things as well. But still, we are all shaped by those by society. One specific test I want to talk about for personality, and this is a very famous one that's used in the US all the time. It's the Who I Am test / the 20 Statements test. And yes, that is me in the right-hand corner with my friends in Kenya, my Maasai friends. Maasai Mara, the safari there, most beautiful thing I've seen in my life. Incredible, incredible place if you can ever visit. But anyway, moving on to the specific study that used the Who I Am test, or I should say administered the Who I Am test to Kenyans and US American undergraduate students. The Kenyan participants should theoretically vary in terms of how much they were exposed to Western cultural ways. So Kenyan university students in Nairobi, which is the capital of Kenya, should be the most westernized group in the sample. Educational system was shaped by the British colonial past. Employed adults in Nairobi might be less westernized, and traditional indigenous Kenyan groups such as Samburu and the Maasai, again, me on the right-hand side, would be less westernized. So kind of the idea here is they're going to administer the Who I Am test to 4 groups of people. 1, US American undergraduate students, okay? Then they're going to administer the same test to a group of university students in Nairobi, the capital of Kenya. Then they're going to administer the test to employed adults, just standard adults in Nairobi. So kind of the idea here is that they're in a big city, they're interacting kind of more with like Western values, and thus going to be a little more westernized. And then also they're going to administer this test to indigenous groups, the Samburu and Maasai, who's thought to be the kind of the least westernized, less exposed to kind of like the big city and kind of political and economic values associated with kind of the Western Europe and the US. So the question is basically, how does kind of exposure to the West impact how people state who they am, or who they are, I should say. How does that impact kind of the responses when taking this test? And all this test basically is the word I am, and then a blank line. So it's I am blank line, and then you just fill it out. And they have 20 of those lines, so thus the 20 statements test. And what the researchers are saying is, do these groups differ on how they describe themselves? That is, how they define their personality? And what the researchers found was the most frequent self-descriptions for the US Americans were personality-based, or personal-based, I should say, such as traits, attitudes, and abilities. 48% of their statements. Those similar statements of self-descriptors made up less than 2% of the Maasai and Samburu self-descriptions. Their responses generally reflected their social identity, their roles, and membership, and that accounted for 60% of their statements. However, this only made up 7% of US American descriptions. So let's break this down. So in the US university students, again, filling out that I am question, 48% of the responses were stuff like trait, attitude, ability related. So I am nice. I am helpful. I am great at math. I love sports. Versus the Maasai, the Samburu groups, who are, again, are kind of the least westernized, most collective, theoretically, group, their overwhelming responses reflected their social identity. So I am a member of X group. I have a specific role. So it's very role-oriented. I am a teacher. I am a fisher, a farmer, something along those lines. So very much tied to kind of a collective sense of identity. So their identity is literally like different, with much more likely to identify or imagine their identity as something consisted of the social, the collective, being influenced by other people, versus kind of US university students much more likely to be self-contained. So it's like, this is me, and that's who I am no matter what. I am smart at reading, I am nice, I'm an empath, those kind of things. But what should be noted here is that it wasn't that in the US college university students that there were no roles or membership responses. And even the Maasai, that there was no personal characteristic, but the rates of those differ. So you can see this in the top right-hand chart, wherein although US American undergraduate students were far more likely to describe who I am as a personality characteristics, they also did have some roles and membership statements as well, but far less. So the rates you can see in those personal characteristics versus social identity varies by culture. So that's telling us that, like, oh, that matters to them. That's what makes up their personality, and thus achieving those outcomes is going to be, thus achieving specific collectivist outcomes is going to be more meaningful to those groups, and thus required to fulfill in order to have kind of positive development. So just an example of how culture, how our environments set expectations, and then we meet them or don't. And then those are kind of reflected, and those cultural values are kind of reflected not just in our culture, but in how we describe the self. Psychosocial moratorium, a period during which individuals are free from excessive obligations and responsibilities and can therefore experiment with different roles and personalities, can be associated with a great time if you enjoy exploration, but can also be associated with anxiety for others. It is necessary due to complications of identity development in modern society, which Erikson argues. It is an important prelude to establishing a coherent sense of identity. Role experimentation is more likely in environments that allow for said expectation. Some consider it a luxury of the affluent. It's not realistic for many people. This type of introspection can interfere with survival. Does a high school teen mom going through this process to the same does a high school teen mom go through this process to the same extent as a student starting at Harvard? According to Erikson, loss of a psychosocial moratorium means lost potential. It's associated with constraints. So kind of the idea here is that this moratorium is a time wherein you don't have a lot of responsibilities, but you're still adult-like, or an adult, like whatever, by 18 years old, like standards, emerging adulthood. So that combination of maybe less responsibilities, but at the same time, a little more freedom as an emerging adult, gives you an opportunity to kind of experiment with different roles in your life, different personalities, figure out who you are, what you want to be, and kind of the idea here is that this is necessarily due to kind of the emergence of modern society, industrializations. Again, those kind of decisions now that you have to make, not necessarily on your own, but just like more decisions, more consequential decisions, not just as a byproduct of being older, but also due to the historical era that you live in. These choices are kind of relatively new, especially from like the human history kind of perspective. Kind of as a consequence of kind of modern society, you now have to make these decisions, and thus kind of like theoretically, you need some time to kind of work through that decision-making process, which obviously kind of the argument then is like, well, how long is that process? And also is like, does everybody have kind of an equal shot to kind of go through this process? Because they have to work to survive. They have family obligations. That maybe someone in the higher class does not have. So, for example, does like a teen mom at 18 years old go through kind of this, or have the opportunity to go through this psycho-moratorium period to the same extent that a student starting at like high school does at 18 years old? And the answer, probably not. So, according to Erickson, this kind of loss of period means kind of a loss of theoretical potential because, again, he argues that you need this period to figure out who you are and thus put yourself in appropriate careers, relationships, friendships, and thus, if it's appropriate, you're going to have a higher likelihood of fulfilling kind of like your peak developmental potential versus kind of never going through this process, not really knowing who you are and never having kind of like a strong fit between who you are, what you want to be, and kind of like your job or your career, your relationships. And for self-evident reasons, kind of lower class is going to have a kind of a less kind of a lower period, a lower length of a moratorium than kind of like higher class adolescents. Forging an identity, Marcia. So this is kind of Marcia's theory of forging identity. He argued that adolescents are classified into one of 4 identity statuses based on their progress toward an identity in several domains. Some of the domains could consist of occupational, religious, political. The key questions are whether an individual has experienced a crisis, wherein they seriously grappled with identity issues and explored alternatives, and achieved a commitment, resolved the questions raised, and settled on identity. Only 5% of adolescents were in the same identity status in all 4 areas. So basically the idea here is that in order to achieve and come to kind of like a conclusion, something along those lines, of an identity, you have to have a crisis. You have to grapple with who you are at this moment, who you want to be, and explore alternatives to who you want to be. And through that kind of process of exploration, you are able to kind of resolve these questions of who you are, what you want to be, and then settle on an identity. So again, you have to kind of go through this process in 4 specific areas. And basically what the 5% number is saying is that you can achieve that identity commitment at different rates. So you can be like amazing at your occupational commitment, or achieve a commitment in an occupational domain, but have not really achieved a commitment or even really gone through a crisis in your religious beliefs, for example. So he argued for different identity statuses, and we'll review a few of them briefly. The first, identity diffusion status, 12 to 15 years of age. During this status, there is no crisis and no commitment. That is, the individual does not have a firm commitments and is not currently trying to make them. They haven't really thought about who they are. So in this case here, you have no crisis and you have no commitment. You really haven't questioned anything, you haven't explored anything, and thus you really haven't achieved kind of final commitment. Foreclosure status, accepting identity suggested to them by their parents or other people. Roles adopted in identity foreclosure often revolved around goals set by parents or other authority figures. That is, they've made commitments, but without a period of exploration. It's a commitment without a crisis. So here it's foreclosed upon. So kind of the idea here is that you've kind of just accepted an identity given to you by parents or whatever, your community or extended family, something along those lines. So therefore you have a strong commitment, but you really have no exploration. Versus the diffusion, you neither have commitment or crisis yet. Then finally, moratorium status, an 18-year-old experiencing a crisis or actively exploring identity, religion, drugs, majors, posting. So kind of the idea now, it's like, okay, now I have a crisis and I'm actively exploring who I am as a person. Maybe I'm whatever, experimental with drugs, I'm switching majors, I'm posting all the time, I just can't stop. Tweeting about whatever issue that I care about. So now you're going through a crisis, you're exploring your identity, but you still have not come to a firm commitment about who you are. And then finally, identity achievement, kind of self-evident by the title, involves not only raising questions, but answering them. So now you have achieved an identity, and you have committed to that identity after kind of raising questions and exploring them. So after going through a crisis. Just 20% of 18-year-olds are at identity achievement, 40% of college students, and about 50% overall around like 24 years of age. So kind of the point here is if you're 22 years old and have not hit an identity achievement, don't panic. Ain't the end of the world. You are in like the majority of people. Identity achievement is associated with higher achievement motivation, moral reasoning, intimacy, and career maturity. For closed state is associated with more authoritarianism, prejudice, need for social approval, lower level of autonomy, greater closeness to parents. Identity diffusion associated with socially withdrawn antisocial behavior, low intimacy. So kind of just stopping here for a moment. For closed, you can think about again, it's kind of like your parents or whatever your collective extended family or some kind of society thing kind of just told you who to be. You never really explored anything, so you kind of have a commitment but no exploration. Thus, it's kind of like, that's why you're more likely to be higher in authoritarianism, because you're literally just focusing towards, or because you're being shaped. Your identity is kind of solidified through a senior, authoritarian, I should say, kind of a source. You know, it's from above that your identity is shaped. Also, this can be related to like social approval because you want to be appear favorably to the person who defined your identity, and lower level of autonomy because it's kind of straightforward. You didn't really have to ever explore independently what your identity is, but rather it was kind of like dictated from above. Identity diffusion, wherein you kind of have no commitment and no exploration, kind of associated with antisocial behavior. So kind of there, you have no commitments to anything, and you're not actively exploring anything. You're kind of just drifting through life. So they kind of associate with antisocial behavior. People who grow up in authoritative homes are encouraged to assert their individuality, but remain connected to the family. Absence of parental warmth is a risk factor for later commitment problems. Agency, increased responsibilities, control of decision-making, confidence, may be more important in industrialized countries. Adulthood is about psychological transitions, but also about entering roles of adulthood. So kind of this sense of agency wherein you've taken more control, you're doing more decision making, correlated with identity achievement. However, there could be differences across culture wherein maybe that kind of independence is less valued or maybe less needed because it's not an industrialized country and you don't have as many of those choices as you have to make. Negative identity. The selection of an identity that is obviously undesirable in the eyes of significant others in the broader community. Usually, this is an attempt to forge a sense of self-definition when it is difficult to establish an acceptable identity. They often repeatedly try and fail to receive positive recognition from those who they define as important to their lives. Look for other ways to be noticed. Most would rather be somebody, quote, bad than nobody at all. So here, we're trying to kind of, in these adolescents, I should say, are trying to come to some kind of identity achievement or just have some kind of identity. However, they're picking identity that they know obviously is frowned upon by society. And obviously there can be differences in kind of like a historical period and like, but kind of whatever. We'll just keep it kind of broadly stated. Whatever, they're in some kind of a gang or kind of antisocial peer group, something along those lines, and are defining themselves in ways that are just typically frowned upon by society. And kind of the idea here is that these adolescents are having difficulty coming to some kind of conclusion of who they are as a person, or maybe if they're a little more collective, what member, what group they belong to, what role, what responsibility they can take to contribute to society, some kind of combination of those kind of theoretically individualistic and a combination of like more collective identity issues coming together to be like, well, I have to be somebody, I have to be part of some group, so it's better to be like in the bad group, be looked upon undesirably than kind of be alone. I'd rather be in a negative group than be alone. You can also see this wherein maybe absent parents who, whatever, maybe have their own issues going on. At the same time, maybe as not having a lot of close relationships in school, not really having a high sense of belonging at school. So they really don't have access to kind of positive social bonds, wherein those positive social relationships with adults or maybe even pro-social peers, giving them kind of like positive feedback, encouraging them along the way to develop a positive sense of identity. So kind of maybe unnoticed, unappreciated, kind of drifting along kind of through the cracks of the school, of the neighborhood, of their parents' their extended family's lives. So they're like, okay, well, I'm not really being noticed, kind of being a little bit quiet and trying to do maybe something a little positive or at least neutral. So let me just be bad and act out. So now I'm getting some kind of attention. I'm getting some kind of social recognition from people that theoretically I'm supposed to care about, and I do care about, but in the absence of like kind of positive feedback, when we get some feedback, in this case, negative feedback is better than non-feedback. I'd rather be somebody than nothing, even if it's negative. Identity is generally not established before age 18, boys even more so. Identity status changes are less systematic than previously believed, can bounce around to different statuses, not in a linear order, such as identity achievement, life foreclosure, maybe temporary. Some adolescents and young adults are perpetually confused about who they are. Achievement is not a final state, but a step in a lengthy process toward establishment of the self. Moratorium may be a greater risk factor the older you are. Turning points brought by internal factors or by specific life events, circumstances impact identities, developmental trajectories, can make meaning out of those turning points to help define / understanding themselves. So kind of like I said before, it is very rare for identity to be established before 18 years of age. Kind of makes sense. You're kind of in a social setting that literally you're never going to be in the rest of your life, like compulsory schooling, during like a specific period of adolescence, very small period of your life. So kind of thinking you're going to have identity solved for the rest of your life by 18, very unrealistic. Also, kind of you shouldn't view kind of identity status, if you even are supporting kind of Marcia's theory, that it goes from like foreclosure to achievement, and then boom, once you hit achievement, you're done. Rather, you can bounce back and forth between foreclosure, achievement, or other kind of statuses as well, depending on kind of the domain and kind of depending on like kind of where you are in life. So thus kind of like achievement is not really like this final step that you reach, but rather kind of maybe a lengthy developmental process that maybe in some way is always kind of impacted by kind of a combination of our internal factors, so such as like discontent, or kind of like restlessness, I should say, with like a job or something, kind of the classic meme of like, oh, I've worked at this job for a year now or 2 years, it's time to get the hell out of here. But also kind of life events and circumstances. So graduating high school, graduating from a good college, having a child, now I've taken on the identity of a parent, or maybe big things that happen in the world, maybe, whatever, some kind of protest kind of thing, some kind of social awareness connecting you to a larger group, whatever. Those kind of social actions at a group level can also impact you as a quote-unquote individual. So kind of your internal kind of state, but also kind of larger factors going on in the world. It can impact you, and thus kind of like, oh, am I really at identity achievement, or is there kind of more kind of quote-unquote work or whatever, more development to go? Ethnic identity, the aspect of individual sense of identity concerning ancestry or racial group membership. as important as occupational, ideological, and interpersonal identity. In the US, it's generally weakest in white youth, more likely to give generalized label, quote-unquote white or American. Working class US white adolescents, however, are more likely to have an ethnic group identity, such as Italian, Irish, and Jewish. Among immigrant adolescents, vacillation between identifying as a member of a broad ethnic category, such as Asian, or a group defined by a country of origin, Chinese. One study found that racial discrimination was associated with higher likelihood of interracial romantic partners, protective against discrimination. Little research has been done on adolescents whose identity is closely linked to their religion. So ethnic identity is also an important kind of a marker of development that takes place during emerging adulthood. This is obviously going to have variation across countries. In the US, kind of looking at white Americans being more likely to describe kind of like a broad label as white, but kind of the lower class you go, working class kind of US white adolescents more likely to have kind of a classify themselves with an ethnic group identity, classic ones being Jewish, Irish, Italian. And you also see differences in how the same people, of the members of the same theoretical group define themselves or whatever, characterize themselves. So, for example, you can take a very broad statement like Asian, which is a super broad term that applies to like billions of people, or something more specific like Chinese, which is still very, very broad. It's a massive country. So kind of like how broad you are can also vary depending on the person and also the historical period. Like Asian is kind of a relatively, like in kind of popular culture, it's kind of a relatively new kind of thing, like student Asian like societies. Again, kind of reflecting in kind of rates of immigration, and all these kind of things are just kind of like social groups that we create, just social arbitrary groups that we create through time that shift due to a whole host of like environmental shifts, which we'll talk about momentarily. The process of ethnic identity development is similar to the process of identity development in general. It can become by an event wherein a person experiences discrimination, becomes unaware of underrepresentation, or feels different, but not always. Period of exploration occurs after crisis. Individuals establish a more coherent sense of personal identity that includes an ethnic identity, aka collective identity. Having a strong ethnic identity helps to foster a sense of meaning in life. It's correlated with higher self-efficacy, better mental health, more positive mental health outcomes, academic achievement. It can work both ways. Having better mental health increases the likelihood of having positive ethnic identity. It's also strongly influenced by the context, such as your schools, your peers, your neighborhoods, your country. Positive ethnic identity is associated with positive attitudes of other ethnic groups. Adolescents with strong ethnic identities are often in crowds where ethnicity is not the primary defining feature. In racial minority youth, academic achievement is highest when feelings are connected to an ethnic group, away from racism, and believe important people in their lives want them to be successful. So again, often, but not always, a kind of sense of ethnic identity can be stimulated through an experience of discrimination or to yourself, but also whatever, like kind of like something pops up on the news, it comes up on like whatever your feed or whatever, and you become aware of it, and you're like, oh, I see this kind of sense of discrimination. Oh, this is kind of related to me. Now I'm kind of identifying and kind of building and establishing a personal and individual identity that now includes a collective. In this case, the collective is racial identity. And this collective can help contribute to kind of a broader meaning in life, kind of a, like, oh, this is our group. These are the challenges our groups faces. This is the great things about our group here, and how do we navigate this? But ultimately, though, you belong to something that's kind of like bigger than yourself. Thus, you're kind of giving a greater meaning beyond like your immediate self. You belong to something greater than yourself. This can contribute to kind of higher, more positive mental health outcomes and kind of higher academic achievement. But the different ways that ethnic identity kind of manifests itself, and even the specific ethnic identities can vary by culture or by country, obviously, neighborhood, your schools, your peers, how much discrimination is there in school, in your neighborhood, how underrepresented are you, what historical period do you live in. All these things matter and kind of when the development, all those things impact the development of your ethnic identity. And it's not just your group necessarily, but maybe that other, like that collective sense of, sense of meaning in life through your ethnic identity also has been found to kind of contribute to positive evaluation of other ethnic groups. So maybe kind of like taking that kind of collective and then sharing it to like a global, theoretically like human kind of level. You can take it multiple stages. But even research suggests that adolescents with strong ethnic identities are not only like just hanging out with other students of their same ethnic group, but rather they often, also depending on the school and kind of racial demographics or ethnic demographics, they often hang out in groups wherein ethnic identity is not the primary defining feature, the primary way of defining identity, but still, even in that case, you could still have a strong ethnic identity. And I've said identity 7 trillion times this slide. Ethnic/racial socialization, process through which individuals develop an understanding of their ethnic or racial background. Parents, communities, extended family teach children about racial identity and about experiences they are more likely to encounter in broader society due to their ethnicity. Racial/ethnic socialization typically focuses on 3 themes, that is, understanding and valuing one's cultures, dealing with racism, and succeeding in mainstream society. Especially the case in undocumented immigrants. It encourages adolescents to think positively about their ethnic heritage, which may lead to a stronger sense of ethnic identity. So through this socialization process, wherein, again, parents, extended family, community members, respected people of that kind of group teach and educate and help the younger children kind of develop that racial and ethnic identity through a socialization process. So they're talking to them about experiences, history of the group, what's going on right now. So kind of a combination of like deeper and richer, theoretically, value of one culture. So kind of historical roots, and so really defining that meaning through kind of like almost like lineage. Kind of like a intergenerational connective tissue that, again, kind of places you within a group that's larger than yourself. You're kind of belong to kind of a historical legacy that is meaningful. At the same time, though, understanding like, there are challenges to belonging to this racial group, and so it's like, so these things still exist. So you can super value these things, but at the same time, other people don't value them, and also there are kind of systematic ways and interpersonal ways wherein you will be discriminated against. So kind of that socialization process of like, how do you navigate that, which really bleeds into like succeeding in mainstream society. So again, kind of like a constraint, a recognition that, listen, there are theoretical better ways to do things, but you exist in this period of time and you can work towards those greater things, but you still got to know how to like navigate the world around you. So kind of like you have to know what's going on, how to quote unquote succeed, whatever that variation. There's a lot of variation of what that means, but how to navigate mainstream society, how to deal with systematic challenges towards you, but also having that protective factor wherein you can theoretically depend on members of this collective group to give you a sense of purpose, meaning, and kind of decrease the impact of those discriminatory stressors in your life. Recent immigrants, they report higher levels of academic, familial, social, and economic stress. They express more positive feelings about the mainstream American ideals than counterparts whose families have been in the U.S. Longer. First-gen or foreign-born perform better in school and are less prone toward delinquent behavior or various problems than adolescents from the same ethnic group with U.S.-born parents. Immigrant paradox. Many measures of psychological functioning and mental health, adolescents who have immigrated more recently to the U.S. score higher on measures of adjustment than adolescents from the same ethnic group whose family has lived in the U.S. for several generations. However, this is not universal. It could be related to idealism fading to disillusionment/alienation. A study of Mexican-American youth found that there is a decline in teenagers' orientation to traditional family values, and this is associated with increases in risky behaviors such as substance abuse. More supervision among newly immigrated parents could be contributing to this. So although they often, recent immigrants often report more stress, they also kind of have a more positive feelings towards the U.S., more kind of idealized version of the U.S. in their head. But interesting, there's a lot of interesting findings here. So looking specifically at how first-gen and foreign-born immigrants performing better at school and less prone to antisocial behavior than adolescents from the same ethnic group within the U.S.-born parents. And this could be related to kind of like that cultural process, where now we kind of have differing cultural values possibly conflicting with each other, and the adolescent having to deal with this. So on the one hand, adolescent having to deal with kind of these theoretically two different, broadly stated, sets of cultural values and ways of interacting, and at the same time, which is challenging, but at the same time having parents maybe who are maybe have kind of as they've spent more time in the U.S., kind of less reliant on kind of traditional ways of kind of navigating the world, having less kind of education in their cultural practices. So kind of like in the family household, kind of a decrease in kind of like the collective protective factors, while at the same time adolescents are kind of dealing with these competing cultural sets of cultural values and kind of norms and expectations. So you're kind of getting more stressful at the same time, losing that kind of traditional collective buffering wherein you can depend on your family kind of for like social support and those kind of things, versus like first gen and foreign born parents and adolescents. They are kind of bringing kind of still that social network wherein they can again depend on that social network and that community for social support. And thus, maybe with time, as immigrant groups stay in the or immigrant families stay in the U.S. longer, and then with each generation, they're losing kind of that traditional heritage, that traditional protective factors that help them navigate the world, kind of due to now living in the U.S., a very hyper individualistic society, a lot more isolated, a lot more alone. But still, you're still kind of a different race. So again, maybe facing more discrimination, more kind of trying to figure out those ethnic identity issues, while at the same time losing that collective support. That combination creating maybe a sense of disillusionment and alienation, which in turn contributes to antisocial behaviors, which you can see in this Mexican American study, but is found also in the kind of other immigrant groups as well. Discrimination. Identity development is influenced by the social context in which adolescents lived. Identity development should be understood as a development within a specific context, and in the cases of most literature we cover in this class, industrialized society. The social context of minority adolescents often includes the following: racial stereotypes, discrimination, which is peers may be at higher risk. Peers may be higher risk than random adults outside of school. Mixed messages about identifying with major culture. The greatest risk among ethnic minority youth with strong attachment to mainstream culture and whose parents were born in the U.S. And immigrants' accents can also be a source of discrimination. A study of Iranians found a significant portion of Iranian U.S. Americans were more likely to identify as Persian than Iranian. Our identities are wrapped up in broader social, economic, political contexts. Discrimination has negative psychological effects, such as conduct problems, depression, poor sleep, lower school achievement. Cross-ethnic friendships and strong positive racial identities help protect against negative effects. So, as stated throughout this class, our social context impacts our developmental outcomes, and in this case, identity. So, for example, discrimination negatively impacts people, but kind of the source of discrimination in adolescence can impact adolescents more or less. So, for example, discrimination from their peers seems to be the highest risk factor of negative developmental outcomes in racial minority groups than kind of just a random person outside of school. So, kind of the idea here maybe is that you value your peers more, their opinions more, so thus kind of being discriminated against by them has a more meaningful impact than just some random person down the street who's kind of like rude to you. And I want to jump to this Iranian study point because I mentioned before, or kind of how some adolescents will describe themselves in very broad terms, such as Asian, and other adolescents will describe themselves in more specific terms, such as Chinese. Well, here you can see kind of the role of like the historical period you live in, and kind of thus like the political impact, or the impact of political context on how people identify themselves. So in this case here, U.S.-Iranian relations, not traditionally characterized as positive, that kind of impacting the sense of Iranian U.S. Americans in the U.S., adolescents, I should say. So they're thinking, oh man, I see people around me kind of like hating on Iran. U.S. and Iran don't have great positive relationships. Thus, I don't really know if I want to identify with that. Let me use a different label here so I can maybe have some kind of collective identity, but at the same time kind of try and get around that potential discrimination from identifying as Iranian American. And not just discrimination, but potentially like violence committed against you, or whatever, being excluded from certain institutions or something along those lines. There are differences in the ways that discrimination is expressed towards adolescent boys and girls, especially among U.S. black teenagers. U.S. black boys are treated with suspicion more often than U.S. black girls, and U.S. black girls face interpersonal prejudices more than U.S. black boys. Adolescents who have experienced discrimination are more likely to believe that the public has low regard for their racial group. People who believe that the public has low regard for their ethnic group are more sensitive to racial cues, which in turn can heighten their experience of discrimination. They are better at perceiving subtle signs of racial bias. Potential differing impacts depending on if the discrimination is perceived from people in daily life versus societal institutions. Former associated with negative impacts, while the latter may make racial groups more likely to work harder. So levels of racial discrimination can vary by gender as well, wherein boys, but in this case the black boys, treated more suspicion, and kind of, so this is one like gender roles, yes, traditionally harmful to women, but also harmful to men. So in this case it's like, oh, they're going to be violent because men are kind of like violent, and then you combine like racial minority status, in this case being black in the U.S., you're more likely to be like suspicious as, appear suspicious to people outside those group, and often also sometimes within that group, because that kind of discrimination is socialized in everyone. So kind of a gender effect as well as a racial effect of discrimination. And then black girls being much more likely to be subjected to interpersonal prejudice as well, kind of relational aggression. Consistent with other kind of markers of aggression found in girls, but still both kind of girls and boys will face the suspicion and interpersonal prejudices, but this is kind of on average. The specific forms of discrimination can vary by gender. And as stated before, the impact of discrimination can vary depending on if someone that they interact with on a daily basis, who theoretically they care about, versus kind of like society's institutions. So it's understandable. So it's research suggests that adolescents understand the difference between like institutional, historic kind of discrimination versus like one-to-one peers, or kind of like the here and now. And so kind of like the negative impact of discrimination on like a more one-to-one level may be more impactful for personal developmental outcomes such as depression or something along those lines, or like negative physical developmental outcomes. Those may be higher in interpersonal discrimination, but specifically wherein you kind of value that person, or you theoretically should, like whatever. A teacher or a parent or extended family member or some kind of valued member of the community or something like that. We're in kind of like a recognition of institutions, kind of discrimination. Some studies have found that it contributes to like, oh, maybe I'll like reform that institution or whatever, get rid of that institution, like depending on your ideological belief. Multi-ethnic adolescence. This multi-ethnic is defined as having two parents of different ethnic or racial backgrounds. In the U.S., this is the most rapid growing demographic, with 14% of infants born in 2015 are multi-ethnic. However, there's a debate about that number because where you kind of classify Latinos is debated. Classified children born to couples in which one parent is white and non-Latino and the other is white and Latino, is that multiracial? So kind of the idea is like, is Latino race? Is Latino an ethnicity? What is that? Well, it's very difficult because these are like social constructs, and thus they're going to be debated. The impact of having race as a central part of one's identity is complicated. In a study of biracial black/white U.S. adolescents, 75% changed self-identity during a 4-year period. So kind of like other identities here, you could see changes in identity, self-identity as adolescents or adults develop. And again, this is going to be impacted by a whole host of things going on within yourself, but also like your community, your schools, your workplaces, the historical period you live in, country, all these kind of things. And thus, like a high rate, you can see here, 75% of black, white, biracial U.S. adolescents changing their self-identity during a 4-year period. And even on the second bullet point, you can see the impact of historical period, because Latino is defined at different things on the census, the U.S. Census. Latino is defined differently depending on like what year you're looking at. So again, kind of the social construct of these kind of things can be difficult. Like my mom's last name is Spanish. Grandparents from Puerto Rico. I'm white. You know what I don't know. So again, depending on the time, the historical period you live in, and whatever the individual person and how your collective identity is, those things can all impact the classification, the percentage of adolescents and newborns who are characterized as multi-ethnic. Identity and gender. Gender identity is one's sense of oneself as a male, female, or transgender. Sexual orientation, whether one is sexually attracted to individuals of the same sex, other sex, or both. Gender role behavior. This is the extent to which an individual behaves in traditional masculine or traditional feminine ways. Let's dive deeper into this, though, understanding the terminology. There is not a strong correlation between sexual orientation and sexual behavior or gender identity. So people with strong same-sex attractions exhibit the same range of masculine and feminine behaviors that is seen among strong heterosexual interests. So for example, exclusively gay men, like heterosexual men, may act in very masculine ways or, quote, very feminine ways, or both. Bisexual people typically are no more confused than heterosexual people. There is no single way for people to discover, come to terms with, and disclose their sexual orientation. Concerns about identity, intimacy, and sexuality are common challenges for teenagers, but prejudice and ignorance may cause additional psychosocial distress for sexual minority adolescents. So a few points here. We kind of have the same range of possible behaviors on quote-unquote masculine and feminine behaviors. That same average range in both heterosexual and gay men, for example. There's also kind of no single developmental process wherein people discover their or disclose their sexual orientation. However, I'll walk through one proposed model for transgender youth. And kind of like all identity development, there are challenges, and like all other developments, depending on kind of the historical period you live in, the context you live in, that can impact your developmental trajectory of your identity here. Or I should say your gender identity or sexual orientation or your sexual behaviors. These things can all be impacted by larger societal things. So whatever, you just imagine a million things that frankly you really don't have to imagine, but laws that don't allow gay marriage, or hell, gay marriage or like gay relationships being illegal, or not differences, adoption laws, differences in gender reassignment surgery, attitudes towards the sexual orientation. All these kind of things are going to impact kind of your trajectory of development, because we are all shaped by these larger macro level environmental factors. Looking specifically at transgender adolescents, having a gender identity that differs from the sex that was assigned at birth is a definition of transgender. Cis is identifying with the gender you were assigned at birth, while trans is identifying with a gender that is different from the one defined at birth. One study among transgender boys found, and to kind of give a definition of transgender boys, individuals who were assigned a female gender at birth but who identified as male. This study found that 17.7% of transgender boys described their sexual orientation as gay, lesbian, about 28% as bisexual, about 11% as heterosexual, and 24% as pansexual. This is defined as attracted to all genders, described in different ways, can be described as fluid or non-binary. These things are, all these kind of terms are still very much in development. Little research has been done on the psychological development and mental health of transgender adolescents. Many experts believe gender identity, sexual orientation, and gender role behavior should be viewed as fluid rather than fixed. So you can see a wide range of variety, really, and sexual orientation in transgender boys in this study. And kind of just overall, kind of a big point here is that there needs to be a lot more research with transgender U.S. Americans and really across the world. Not a lot of, we really don't know a lot about a lot of things, but for transgender youth, we know even less. So, yes, maybe a potential project idea. I did want to give an example, though, gender role behaviors. Again, this is kind of just traditional gender roles. You can think of it very simply. Like, oh, the guy, he's working at the coal mines. He's taking care of the family, while the wife is at home taking care of the children. So whatever, those kind of traditional gender roles. Now, let's briefly talk about some a model that proposes 5 stages of transgender development. That is pre-coming out, coming out, exploration, intimacy, and identity integration. However, there is no single path, and it depends on the social and economic resources and characteristics of the person. So let's just briefly talk about these stages. I talk about these more in other developmental courses, but just to give you, a quick overview so you get exposed to some of these models. Beginning with pre-coming out, during this stage of development, children feel confused as they realize they do not fit into either of the 2 gender categories. The coming out stage, begin to acknowledge to themselves and others that they do not fit the standard gender identities, and this can occur across the lifespan. So it's not like 10 years old, not 12 years old, it could be 50. Again, a lot of variation here. Studies show that transgender adults acknowledge feeling different from others as a child. So kind of what that research suggests is, yes, transgender youth are able to identify and come to an accurate conclusion that, hey, I feel different from others as a child. I do not fit into any of these gender categories. The supermajority of those adolescents or I should say, those feelings are predictive of formally coming out as transgender as an adult. So I'm just saying that those feelings are not just like random or not accurate. They are very accurate and are predictive of kind of transgender status as an adult or whenever they progress through these theoretical stages. Again, I'm sure there are other models as well, but this is just one model. The next stage is exploration, learning as much as possible, testing boundaries of what this identity means, research and consider how to best live, such as things as their name, clothing, surgery, hormones. Intimacy. Transgender men seem to have an easier time than transgender women, could be related to traditional gender roles. Positive and intimate relationships are influenced by one's sexual orientation. Like non-transgender youth, heterosexuals have a smoother path than homosexual orientation trans youth. So you can see kind of those background also norms and histories of disenfranchisement of other groups. So we're in heterosexual transgender youth having an easier path through their stages of development than homosexual transgender youth. And for exploration, kind of almost the same as we talked about with other forms of identity exploration, just testing the boundaries, experimentation, but here obviously more related to being transgender. So name, clothing, surgery, hormone, sex reassignment surgery, all that kind of like research. Identity integration, union of one's public and private life. Research indicates that their gender perceptions of self are much like those of transgender children of their expressed roles. You don't really need to know the last bullet point, but kind of the idea here is integration. This is basically identity achievement, where and now how you define yourself privately is now can be expressed like outwardly in the public life, and thus kind of like a union and integration between the private self and the public self, and thus theoretically you are now fulfilled because you are your purest version of the self in both private world and in the public arena. Now looking at some of the specific adversity that transgender youth experience, 2/3 of transgender youth report bullying, harassment, and verbal abuse. About 43% of transgender youth have been bullied on school property. This is compared to about 18-20% in cisgender youth. Transgender youth were more likely in 2019 to have been bullied on school property than 2017. So again, kind of a historical impact. The rates of targeted behavior bullying increased with time. One study in California found that that 1/3 of transgender teenagers reported suicidal ideation, about twice as high as their peers. And these abuses can range from parents, peers, their job, education, teachers, and just kind of broader kind of society, like discriminatory laws and all that. However, supportive family and peers help protect against abuse, so consistent with all other adversity, having kind of strong social support and peers, your family, also having strong economic resources, all kind of predictive of a reduction in the negative impacts of experiencing discrimination on developmental outcomes. Gender role development. There are far more similarities than differences between men and women. Differences within men and women are far larger than differences between men and women. In statistics, this is known as the kind of fact that differences within a group are generally always larger than differences between a group. Gender intensification hypothesis, the idea that pressure to behave in sex-appropriate ways intensify during adolescence. Beliefs about gender roles become more flexible as adolescents move through adolescence. Social pressures may drive teenagers toward more gender stereotypical behavior. An impact of environmental expectations of gender far more predictive than on behavior than puberty. Adolescents who grow up in relatively more gender-equal countries report higher self-satisfaction than adolescents who grow up in countries wherein women have relatively less power/resources than men. Not all studies find an increase in gender stereotypical behavior in adolescence. Over the past 30 years, an increase in adolescent support for gender equality in the workplace. So basically, the gender intensification process hypothesis is arguing that as adolescents move, or I should say as children reach adolescence, there is an elevated level of social pressure to behave in sex-appropriate ways. However, once you progress through adolescence, then all of a sudden those gender roles become much more flexible. So we kind of see like a peak and then kind of a decline in kind of rigidity in gender roles through adolescence. And thus necessarily it's not just puberty kind of driving things, but rather the environment is the far more predictive a predictor of behavior and gender role behaviors than any kind of just puberty biologically related difference between men and women. And one specific developmental outcome that is like life satisfaction. In general, adolescents who grow up in countries with more egalitarian gender roles, wherein women have progressively equal levels of power and resources as men, the closer that is, the more likely adolescents are to report higher life satisfaction. So again, bigger things beyond like yourself kind of contributing to, in this case, sense of life satisfaction. And not only that, but specific social pressures vary by historical period. So within the last 30 years, support for equality in the workplace has increased in adolescence, thus maybe changing some kind of gender expectations within that cohort or within that period of time. Maybe it'll go back the other way, who knows? But just, we know that that is a social pressure that has shifted during the past 30 years. And thus potentially impacting the developmental trajectory of gender roles in those cohorts of adolescents. Masculinity and femininity. Individuals vary in their degrees of femininity and masculinity, but a person is relatively stable over time. Boys and girls who behave in gender-typical ways are more accepted than those peers whose behavior is more gender atypical. Girls are quote-unquote allowed to display masculine traits, however boys are strongly discouraged from displaying any traditional feminine traits. Adherent to gender typical behaviors can lead to its own set of problems, however. So let's stop there actually for a second. So we see boys and girls who behave in gender quote-unquote atypical ways, facing more challenges to development, kind of like a social pressure from peers, forcing boys to act in quote masculine ways and girls in feminine ways. However, as I've talked about before throughout this class, there's really not like a girl situation wherein boys can act in traditional feminine ways without being, being bullied for not being masculine enough. Obviously, it was broadly stated, but kind of they're at a greater risk of doing so than girls displaying quote-unquote traditional masculine traits. However, even behaving in gender-typical ways has its own problems, as stated. So boys who behave in more, quote, traditional masculine ways are more likely to be accepted by other boys, but more likely to engage in delinquent behaviors. This could be related to being quote-unquote man enough to take negative, risky decisions, and boys who live in adverse environments may need to adopt, quote, macho culture to survive. Girls who behave in more, quote, traditional feminine ways are more at risk of developing eating disorders. Girls who believe their worth is primarily through their sexual appearance are at greater risk for lower academic achievement. Girls who have higher levels of sexualized Facebook photos were judged by other girls to be less competent than girls with less sexual photos in a 2016 study. So, as stated, it's not just atypical or gender atypical behaviors putting a child at risk or just a risk that you have to navigate as an adolescent, but also traditional masculine and feminine behaviors. Traditional, because I'm putting in quotes, because there's not just one tradition. There are different traditions of masculine and feminine behavior, but we know that when we say tradition, we just basically mean the U.S. from 100 years ago. But anyway, that may be a risk factor because, for example, boys, what is traditional? Well, cool, I got to be man enough. I got to take super risky decisions. I got to drink and drive. I got to go jump off that cliff. I got to go fight somebody. Those kind of, quote unquote traditional masculine behaviors, and thus those behaviors put you on risk of like literally physical harm, but also kind of social isolation or really just having peers that are antisocial because other people who aren't behaving those ways are going to be like, hey, I don't want you to like punch me all the time. So thus you're kind of isolated, you're stuck with antisocial peers, and then again, you're at risk of negative developmental outcomes. For girls, behaving in quote-unquote traditional ways. So again, kind of broadly stated, we got men committing violence, jumping off roofs, and whatever, fighting people. And then we have girls maybe more likely being like influenced by marketing or makeup marketing, fashion, those kind of things, and kind of having that thin body ideal, and really kind of implicit in that is kind of like developing a sense of worth centered around your attractiveness, and all of that kind of is predictive of risk factor. All of those things are kind of risk factors for lower academic achievement, less positive social relationships, and a higher increased risk of disordered eating. Okay, with that said, thank you so much for everyone listening. I hope you have a great week. Bye.